The prairie night stretched endless and dark, painted in bruised clouds and restless winds that tore across the open plains. Lightning cracked in the distance, jagged forks splitting the sky before vanishing into black. Jack Turner pulled the brim of his weathered Stetson low as he rode along the dirt trail, his coat flapping against the horse's side. His old Mustang, Dusty, groaned with every step, weary from a long day's travel. Jack's muscles ached, but his mind stayed sharp. Out here, you couldn't afford to lose yourself to exhaustion. One moment of carelessness on the frontier could cost a man his horse, his cattle, or his life. The smell of rain mixed with earth clung in the air. Jack's lantern swung faintly from his saddle, casting pale light that barely reached the edges of the road. He leaned forward and muttered to Dusty, "Just a little longer, boy. Barn's not far." His voice was rough, the kind worn down by years of dust and smoke, but still calm enough to soothe the animal. When the barn finally came into sight, it was a welcome shape against the storm-tossed horizon. A squat, sturdy structure of wood he'd hammered together himself. It wasn't pretty, but it was home enough. Jack dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft mud, and led Dusty under the shelter. He wiped water from his brow, glad for the roof overhead. The wind howled around the boards like some restless spirit, and thunder shook the ground beneath him. Jack unfastened the saddle, tossing it onto a rail, then reached for the feed bucket. That's when he noticed something strange, a flicker of movement near the far corner, just beyond the stacked hay bales. Jack froze, his hand instinctively brushing the revolver at his hip. His eyes narrowed. Out here, any shadow could mean trouble. Coyotes, thieves, or worse. Slowly, carefully, he set the bucket down and drew the gun halfway from its holster. "Who's there?" His voice cut through the barn, low and steady. No answer came. Only the sound of rain rattling the roof and the restless shifting of Dusty's hooves. Jack took a step closer, boots crunching on straw. His lantern swung, throwing long, stretching shadows across the walls. Then he saw it. Huddled against the haystack was a small figure, thin, fragile, trembling as if the storm itself had seeped into his bones. Jack blinked, lowering the revolver slightly. It wasn't a thief or a drifter. It was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his hair dark and tangled, his clothes little more than rags clinging to his body. His skin was stretched tight over ribs that jutted out like cage bars, his cheeks hollowed by hunger. Wide, dark eyes stared at Jack with a mix of fear and desperation, shining like wet stones in the lantern light. Jack's heart tightened in his chest. He'd seen hunger before, during cattle drives gone wrong, in mining camps where men worked themselves to death for a scrap of bread. But never in someone this young. The boy flinched when Jack stepped forward, curling into himself like a stray animal bracing for a blow. For a moment, Jack stood there, torn between caution and compassion. He knew enough about the frontier to understand that not every encounter was harmless. A child might be a scout, bait for a trap. Some bands left orphans behind as decoys to lure in men with bleeding hearts. But then Jack looked closer. The boy's lips were cracked, his breath shallow and rattling. This wasn't a trick. This was starvation. Jack holstered the revolver and crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Easy, kid," he said softly, his voice losing its edge. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The boy shook his head weakly, pressing back against the hay. His hands, thin and trembling, clutched a broken piece of leather, like it was the last thing keeping him alive. Jack recognized it as the strap of an old moccasin, worn down to nothing. "You hungry?" Jack asked. The boy's eyes darted toward him, then away, but he didn't answer. Jack sighed, stood, and walked to the shelf where he kept his supplies. He pulled out a tin of beans, a loaf of bread gone a little stale, and the pot of stew he'd left cooling by the fire earlier that day. The boy's eyes followed every move, pupils wide and desperate. Jack set the food down on a wooden crate, tore a chunk of bread, and dipped it into the stew. The smell of beef and onion filled the barn, and the boy swallowed hard, unable to hide the instinct. Jack held out the bread. "Go on. Ain't poisoned." For a long moment, the boy didn't move. Then slowly, he reached out a shaking hand, snatched the bread, and shoved it into his mouth with a ferocity that made Jack's chest ache. The child ate like someone who hadn't touched food in days, maybe weeks, chewing fast, almost choking in the process. Jack quickly poured water from his canteen and handed it over. The boy gulped it down, water spilling over his chin and soaking into his ragged shirt. "Slow down, son," Jack said gently. "Ain't nobody taking it away from you." The boy looked up at him then, eyes glistening with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. His lips parted, and in broken English he whispered, "Thank you, Cowboy." His voice was so faint it nearly broke apart in the air, but it struck Jack harder than a bullet. Jack didn't reply right away. He just watched as the boy continued to eat, each bite filling out a little of the hollowness in his face. When the stew was gone, Jack brought over a wool blanket and wrapped it around the boy's narrow shoulders. The child shivered, clutching it close, his small frame disappearing inside the folds of warmth. Jack leaned back against the wall of the barn, his revolver still at his side, but his heart heavy with something else entirely. He didn't know where this child had come from or who he belonged to. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't turn him away. Not in a storm like this, not in a world this cruel. The boy's eyes fluttered shut as exhaustion overtook him, the kind of deep weariness only hunger could carve into a body. Within moments he was asleep, breathing slow and steady for the first time in who knew how long. Jack sat there in silence, listening to the storm battering the plains outside, the smell of wet earth seeping through the cracks in the barn. He stared at the boy, wrapped in his blanket, and felt a strange shift inside himself. A cowboy's life was meant to be solitary, just a man, his horse, and the land. Yet here fate had delivered something unexpected. Jack Turner didn't know it then, but the small kindness he had shown, a bowl of stew, a warm blanket, a safe place for the night, was about to ripple far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The first light of dawn broke reluctantly over the horizon, bleeding pale gold into the storm-washed sky. Jack Turner stirred awake on the wooden chair where he had dozed off, one hand resting near his revolver, the other draped over his thigh. The barn smelled of hay, rain, and faint smoke from the dying fire in the corner. He blinked groggily, pushing his hat back to rub his eyes. For a moment he forgot the boy was there, until he turned and saw him curled beneath the wool blanket, still asleep, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. Jack felt something rare stir inside him, relief. The boy had survived the night. He had eaten, drunk water, and slept without waking in terror. That was more than Jack had expected when he'd first seen those hollow eyes peering at him through the shadows. Jack stretched, his joints popping, and muttered, "Well, Dusty, looks like we got ourselves company." His Mustang flicked an ear in response, chewing lazily at hay. He decided to step outside and fetch water from the creek before the boy woke. The morning was quiet, the storm having passed, leaving the land fresh and damp. Jack breathed deep, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The plains stretched out endlessly, grasses sparkling with dew, sky vast and endless above. For a brief moment he allowed himself to feel at peace. But peace on the frontier never lasted. At first it was just a low rumble, so distant Jack thought it might be thunder left behind from the storm. But as he stood there, bucket in hand, the ground beneath his boots began to tremble. Dust rose in the distance, a long gray line shifting and growing against the morning light. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, like 100 drums beating in unison. Jack's gut clenched. That wasn't thunder. That was horses. He dropped the bucket and sprinted back into the barn, his instincts sharper than thought. The boy was awake now, blinking, confused by the sudden noise. Jack grabbed his rifle from the wall, checked the chamber, and moved to the doorway. His breath caught in his chest as the figures came into focus. They were riders, dozens at first, then more, stretching into what seemed like an endless tide. Painted faces, feathers, spears glinting in the sun, war cries muted by distance but unmistakable in their rhythm. Jack's eyes widened as he counted in disbelief. 50, 100, more. By the time the first wave slowed and drew close to his barn, he realized the truth. There were 200 of them. 200 warriors on painted horses, their bodies taut and fierce, their movements perfectly in sync as though they were part of one living beast. The earth shook with the pounding of hooves, dust swirling around them like smoke. The sight was both breathtaking and terrifying, an unstoppable force bearing down on one man and his small wooden barn. Jack felt his throat tighten. He raised the rifle instinctively, though deep down he knew what a fool's move it would be. One man with a rifle against 200 mounted warriors? It wasn't even a fight. It was a death sentence. Behind him, the boy scrambled to his feet, eyes wide. He ran to the doorway, staring out. His expression changed instantly. Not fear, but recognition, relief, even joy. He turned to Jack, pointing toward the riders. "My people," he whispered, his voice trembling. Jack's stomach dropped. Of course, The boy wasn't just some orphan who had wandered off into the storm. He belonged to them. He was their kin, and Jack had sheltered him, fed him, saved him. But would they see it that way? Or would they see a lone cowboy holding their child hostage in his barn? The warriors thundered to a halt 100 yards from the barn, forming a line so straight and sharp it looked carved into the land itself. Horses pawed the ground, snorting, their painted bodies gleaming with sweat. Spears and bows rose high, feathers snapping in the wind. The boy stepped forward, his blanket still draped around his shoulders, and cried out in his language, words Jack couldn't understand but felt down to his bones. The line shifted. One rider dismounted and strode forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his chest bare except for necklaces of bone and claw. His face was marked with deep paint, his eyes sharp as flint. Around him silence fell, heavy as a storm cloud. Jack gripped the rifle tighter, every instinct screaming at him to stand ready. But something in the warrior's gaze made him pause. This wasn't the look of a man about to kill. This was the look of a man measuring another, weighing him on an invisible scale. The chief stopped 10 paces away. He looked from Jack to the boy, then back again. The boy spoke, his small voice carrying over the hush. His words were hurried, desperate, but his tone was clear. Gratitude. The child gestured toward Jack, miming food, pointing at his stomach, then wrapping the blanket tight around himself. Jack said nothing. He didn't move, didn't lower the rifle, though his hands ached from the grip. The boy's eyes turned to him, pleading, as if begging him to trust. Then the chief raised a hand. In perfect unison, 200 warriors struck the butts of their spears into the ground. The sound rolled through the earth like thunder, rattling the barn walls and vibrating in Jack's chest. Dust lifted, horses reared, and for one heart-stopping moment, Jack thought it was the signal to charge. But no charge came. Instead, the chief spoke in halting English, his voice deep and commanding. "You cowboy." "You fed him?" He gestured toward the boy. Jack swallowed hard, then nodded once. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "Yeah, kid was starving. Gave him food. That's all." The chief studied him in silence, his expression unreadable. Around them, the warriors waited, still as stone, every eye fixed on Jack. He felt the weight of 200 gazes pressing down on him, judging, deciding his fate. The boy stepped forward, clutching Jack's sleeve with his small hand, his voice breaking. "He helped me, no hurt. He good." For a long, breathless moment, time seemed to stop. Jack could feel the beat of his own heart, the nervous shifting of Dusty in the stall behind him, the quiet rattle of rainwater dripping from the barn roof. Then the chief lifted his chin, his eyes locked on Jack, sharp and unblinking. He extended his arm slowly, palm outward, not a threat but a gesture of recognition. Jack lowered the rifle just slightly, enough to show he wasn't aiming anymore, but not enough to leave himself completely bare. The barn, the plains, the whole wide world seemed to hang in balance. And then the chief's voice cut through the silence again. "You gave freely, without ask. This we remember." Another strike of spears, another thunderous boom that shook the earth. This time Jack didn't flinch. He stood firm, breathing slow, as 200 warriors bowed their heads briefly, acknowledging something he couldn't yet name. The boy's grip tightened on his sleeve, and Jack glanced down. The child was smiling, small, tired, but filled with a trust Jack hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a long, long time. Jack realized then that whatever storm he thought he'd weathered last night was nothing compared to what was coming, and yet somehow for the first time in years he didn't feel alone in facing it. The morning air felt carved from glass, sharp and cold against Jack Turner's skin. He stood in the doorway of his barn, rifle still in his hands but no longer pointed, staring down the line of warriors stretched across the plains. 200 riders sat astride their painted horses in perfect silence, a wall of eyes, feathers, and steel. Their presence made the land itself seem smaller, the wide prairie suddenly too narrow to hold the weight of so many men. Jack's heart pounded. He had faced stampedes, wildfires, and gunfights in backwater saloons, but never this. One wrong word, one wrong move, and he'd be swallowed whole by the tide standing before him. The chief moved closer, his steps measured, his eyes locked on Jack like a hawk studying prey, or perhaps an equal. His chest was bare despite the cold, streaked with white paint and draped with necklaces of bone that clinked softly as he walked. The air seemed to bend around him, heavy with authority. The boy tugged at Jack's sleeve, whispering in his own tongue before switching to broken English. "Chief, my people." His voice was urgent, pleading, as if begging Jack not to raise his rifle again. The chief stopped just a few paces away, close enough now that Jack could see the lines etched into his weathered face, the scars that told stories older than Jack's own lifetime. The chief raised his chin and spoke, his voice deep, rolling across the barnyard like distant thunder. "This boy," he said slowly, his accent thick but his English steady, "is blood of my people. He wandered hungry." His gaze sharpened. "You fed him." Jack swallowed hard. "That's right. He was starving. Couldn't just leave him." The silence that followed was suffocating. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Jack's finger twitched near the trigger of his rifle, though deep down he knew firing now would be suicide. The chief turned to his warriors, then back to Jack. His voice grew louder, carrying to every ear in the field. "No man outside our tribe has ever done this without ask. Always they want land. Always they want gold. Always they want something." His eyes narrowed. "But you gave freely." The boy nodded vigorously, stepping forward. "He help, he give food, blanket. He good man." His small voice cracked, but carried enough force to reach even the riders farthest back in the line. The chief regarded Jack in silence for a long time. Then, without warning, he raised his hand high. In perfect unison, 200 warriors slammed the butts of their spears into the ground. The sound was deafening, like 100 drums crashing together. The earth shook beneath Jack's boots, rattling the barn walls. Dust swirled up from the ground, rolling across the field like smoke from a fire. Jack flinched despite himself, tightening his grip on the rifle. His horse whinnied nervously inside, stomping against the stall. Yet still no charge came. No arrows flew. The warriors held their ground, their eyes locked on Jack. The echo of the spear strike hung in the air like a thunderclap frozen in time. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling over Jack. "You gave food. You gave warmth. You did not harm him. This," he said, pressing his palm flat against his chest. "We remember." Jack lowered the rifle slightly. His voice came out rough but steady. "Didn't do it for thanks. Kid needed help, so I helped. Simple as that." The chief's eyes narrowed as though searching Jack's soul. Then slowly, his stern mouth softened into something that almost looked like respect. Behind him, the warriors struck their spears into the earth again. Boom! The sound rippling through Jack's chest. This time, though, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like recognition. Jack glanced at the boy, who was now smiling for the first time, his small hand gripping Jack's coat as though to tether him in place. Still, Jack's mind whirred with unease. He'd heard stories whispered in saloons, tales told around campfires by men who claimed to know something about the tribes. Some spoke of warriors burning ranches to the ground, punishing trespassers with merciless wrath. Others spoke of debts that could never be repaid, bonds forged not in blood but in honor. Jack had never known which stories to believe until now. The chief raised his hand once more. This time the line of warriors dismounted in unison. 200 feet hit the ground at once, their horses snorting as reins jingled. The sound was eerie, precise, like a ritual Jack couldn't begin to understand. The chief's voice dropped, deep as the roots of the earth. "Cowboy," he said, almost tasting the word, "you stand alone, but today you are seen." Jack's chest tightened. He didn't fully grasp the meaning, but he could feel the weight of it. The eyes of 200 men pressed down on him, not as prey, not as an enemy, but as something else entirely. The boy stepped closer to the chief now, speaking in his own tongue. The words were rapid, filled with energy, pointing to Jack, miming food, miming warmth. The chief listened, his head tilting, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. When the boy finished, the chief gave a single sharp nod. Then came another thunderous strike of spears. Boom! The sound rolled out like a wave, echoing off the plains. But this time the warriors let out a low, unified hum, a sound deep in their throats, vibrating with power. It was neither a war cry nor a threat. It was something older, something that seemed to bind the air itself. Jack stood frozen, his rifle lowered completely now, his mind reeling. Whatever this was, whatever ritual or judgment he was witnessing, it was bigger than him, bigger than his barn, his cattle, his little plot of land on the edge of nowhere. The boy turned to Jack, his eyes bright with something Jack hadn't seen in years: hope. He gripped Jack's hand tightly, whispering, "They know." "They see you." Jack didn't reply. He couldn't. For the first time in a long while, he felt words were useless. All he could do was stand there as the chief's stare burned into him like fire. As 200 warriors acknowledged something he didn't yet understand. The earth was still humming from the last strike of spears when Jack realized something else. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The air was still trembling with the last echo of spears when silence fell again across the plains. The cowboy stood with his boots planted firmly in the mud outside his barn, rifle hanging loose in his hands, his breath visible in the crisp dawn. 200 warriors waited, their eyes unblinking, their presence heavy enough to press against Jack Turner's chest like a weight. The boy remained at Jack's side, his small fingers wrapped around Jack's hand. His blanket trailed against the earth, stirring in the breeze. His eyes, dark and shining, never left the chief, who now stood directly before Jack. The chief's stare was fierce, but there was no hatred in it. Only something deeper. Respect maybe, judgment, perhaps both. He stepped forward until the space between them was nothing but breath and silence. Jack could smell the faint scent of earth smoke and animal hide clinging to him. "You fed him," the chief said again, voice rolling like distant thunder. He placed his hand over his own chest. "This boy, our blood, our future." His gaze burned through Jack. "You gave food. You gave warmth. You did not harm. You asked for nothing." Jack's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being studied like a specimen. His instinct was to shrug, to wave it off as nothing. But he found his throat dry, his voice sticking. At last he managed. "Didn't seem right to let a kid starve, storm or no storm. Any man with a soul would have done the same." The chief's eyes narrowed as though weighing those words. Then slowly he raised his arm and swept it outward. Behind him, 200 warriors struck their spears into the earth once more. Boom! The sound shook the prairie, rolling like thunder across the land. The horses reared and pawed, but the riders held them steady, faces solemn. The chief spoke louder now, his words carrying to every ear. "Cowboy, from this day, your land, your cattle, your barn, untouched. No man, no blade, no fire shall harm you. You are under our watch, under our protection." The boy's grip on Jack's hand tightened, his lips parting into a wide smile. His eyes gleamed with joy and relief, as though his heart had been waiting for this very moment. Jack blinked, his chest tightening. He hadn't asked for protection. He hadn't even thought about what his kindness might buy him. Yet here he was, a solitary man suddenly surrounded by 200 guardians who had, in their way, sworn him an oath stronger than iron. The warriors lifted their weapons high, spears and bows flashing in the morning light. Then they struck them into the earth together. Boom! This time the sound didn't feel like thunder. It felt like a drumbeat of allegiance. Dust swirled up, golden in the rising sun. Jack lowered his rifle completely, letting it rest against the wall of the barn. For the first time since they'd arrived, he let himself breathe freely. He looked down at the boy who was watching him with an expression far too old for his years, an expression of trust. The chief stepped closer. He placed one hand on Jack's shoulder, heavy and solid. His voice dropped, soft enough that only Jack and the boy could hear. "Kindness is not forgotten. The prairie has long memory. You gave life to him." He glanced at the boy. "Now life watches over you." Jack felt his throat tighten. He wasn't a man who cried, hadn't shed tears in years, but something about those words sank deep. He managed a rough nod, tipping his hat slightly in respect. The chief turned back to his people and raised his arm. At once, the warriors mounted their horses again with movement so fluid it looked rehearsed. Feathers swayed, hooves struck the earth, and the line began to shift, flowing like a river of color and motion. Dust rose in waves, sparkling in the sun. The boy stepped forward, clutching his blanket. He shouted something in his language, his voice high and clear. The riders answered with a low rumble, a sound that vibrated in Jack's bones. Then, with a single unified motion, they turned their horses and began to ride. The sound of hooves thundered across the plains, fading slowly as they disappeared into the horizon. Feathers flashed one last time in the sunlight before vanishing into the distance. Within moments, the land was quiet again. The only sounds the rustling of grass and the soft creak of the barn. Jack stood frozen, staring after them. The boy remained at his side, still watching, still smiling. Slowly, Jack knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. His voice was quiet, rough but gentle. "Looks like you're safe now, kid." The boy tilted his head. his dark eyes locking onto Jack's. Then, with all the certainty his small frame could muster, he whispered, "You are safe, too." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder, feeling the fragile bones beneath. For once in his wandering, lonesome life, he didn't feel alone. The sun broke fully over the horizon, casting golden light across the wet earth. Dusty snorted inside the barn, pawing impatiently as though sensing the shift in the air. Jack stood, his gaze still fixed on the trail where the warriors had vanished. He thought about the storm, about the hungry child who had stumbled into his barn, about the 200 men who had come like thunderclouds and left like a blessing. He shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief, and whispered to himself, "Kindness don't cost a man much, but sometimes it buys him the whole world." The boy tugged on his coat, smiling up at him, and Jack ruffled his tangled hair gently. Together they turned back toward the barn as the prairie stretched wide and endless around them. Peaceful now, but forever changed.